Welcome to What the Sigma. I'm Chad Stacks. Today we're pulling apart the Apple versus OpenAI trade secret lawsuit, and I don't mean the headline version everyone's been recycling. There's an allegation buried in this complaint that's structurally different from anything Apple has filed before. It implicates a $6.4 billion acquisition, and it lands at a moment that could seriously complicate OpenAI's path to a public offering. Let's get into it. Everyone's reading the Apple versus OpenAI lawsuit as the same story we've seen twice already. Ex-employees walk out the door, files in hand, cue the injunction. That's the Revo story from a few years back. That's the Oppo story from last year, and it's wrong. Or at least it's missing the part that matters, because buried in this complaint is an allegation that is structurally different from anything Apple has tried before. Apple says Tang, its former hardware VP, now OpenAI's chief hardware officer, directed job candidates still working for Apple to bring, quote, actual parts from Apple to their interviews for, quote, show and tell sessions, where he and his team could, quote, elicit still more Apple confidential information. You catch what that means? These aren't departed engineers. These are people currently badging into Apple every morning, allegedly walking out with hardware in their bags to go audition for OpenAI. That's not a leak. That's a recruiting funnel engineered to harvest IP from people who haven't quit yet. Every OpenAI interview loop becomes, in Apple's telling, an alleged crime scene, and it implicates Apple's own current staff, not just the ones who left. Let me set the board. Apple filed in the Northern District of California against OpenAI, Tang, a former engineer named Chang Liu, and a company called IO Products. That last one matters. IO Products is the Jony Ive startup, co-founded with Tang, that OpenAI bought for $6.4 billion. So Apple isn't just naming the people. It's naming the acquisition itself as a defendant. Apple is saying the thing OpenAI paid $6.4 billion for is built, at least in part, on stolen Apple IP. The language in the filing is not hedged. Apple wrote that, quote, at every level, from members of its technical staff to its chief hardware officer, and in coordination with business partners, OpenAI has been stealing Apple's trade secrets. At every level. That's a company telling a federal judge this was coordinated top to bottom. And here's the number that makes the coordination framing land. Reports indicate more than 400 former Apple employees have joined OpenAI. Now I want to flag that figure carefully. It traces back to a single source layer I couldn't verify against the original text, so hold it loosely. But if it's even directionally right, 400 is not attrition. 400 is a migration. That's the scale that turns Apple's, quote, coordinated campaign story from a lawyer's adjective into something a jury can picture. Now here's where I tell you why this suit is not posturing. Because most people hear Apple sues over trade secrets and assume it's PR theater, a way to slow a competitor with legal fees. That read is lazy, and the precedent proves it. Look at how Apple litigates. In the Revos case, Apple didn't say someone took some files. Apple documented that a specific engineer transferred approximately 390 gigabytes between July 26th and July 29th of that year. Named dates, named volume. In the Oppo case last year, Apple stated that Chen Shi downloaded 63 files to a USB drive 3 days before leaving, and then searched how to wipe a MacBook. Nothing says innocence like Googling how to erase the evidence. That's the real move here, and it's worth respecting for what it actually is. Apple runs a forensic surveillance apparatus on its own devices that logs file counts, timestamps, transfer volumes, and search history at a granularity most companies can't match. Apple doesn't file trade secret suits as phishing expeditions. Apple files when it already has device-level forensics locked. That's why these cases don't drift. In Revos, Apple asked for a reasonable royalty rate in lieu of damages, which tells you the endgame. These suits are built to pressure the other side into settlement or a licensing arrangement, because the defendant looks at the forensic trail and realizes discovery only gets worse. So when Apple names Tang and Cheng Liu personally, understand what that signals. Apple thinks it has the receipts. On Liu specifically, I'll note the sources disagree. One framing says he stole an Apple laptop outright. Another says he retained a company laptop after leaving and then exploited a security vulnerability to access Apple's cloud storage. Retention plus a cloud exploit is a materially different and frankly worse allegation than walking off with a machine. That contradiction isn't resolved in the coverage, so I'm not going to pretend I know which one the filing actually says. But here's a thread nobody is pulling. If Tan directed current Apple employees to smuggle parts into interviews, where are those employees now? Nobody names them. Nobody asks whether Apple has fired them or plans to sue its own staff. That is the live grenade in this complaint, and the coverage walks right past it. There's more Apple isn't getting asked. The metal finishing technique. Apple alleges OpenAI asked a hardware partner to perform a metal finishing technique that Apple invented, while misleading that partner into believing they had Apple's permission. That extends liability into OpenAI's supply chain, not just its hires. And it's the kind of narrow, specific process an injunction could actually freeze. Which brings us back to the number I set aside earlier, and to the timing. This landed 2 months after OpenAI beat Elon Musk in a jury trial, and it lands while OpenAI is prepping for a widely expected IPO. A pending trade secret suit with injunction exposure on the hardware roadmap is not a footnote. It's a disclosure item. It's a discount factor for anyone buying OpenAI shares on the secondary market. If Apple wins even a narrow injunction on that metal finishing process, OpenAI's first hardware launch, the one Sam Altman said reached prototype stage back in the fall, could slip. Nobody is pricing that. The coverage calls it, quote, another risk, and moves on. And notice who hasn't said a word. In the Oppo case, the defendant issued a flat denial within a day. Here, OpenAI, Tang, IPO products, silence. In a story this loud, an empty chair is conspicuous. Now the part that makes this genuinely awkward. In 2024, Apple put ChatGPT inside iOS. Altman flew to Apple headquarters for the announcement. That integration is still live inside Apple Intelligence today. So Apple is currently shipping the product of a company it is accusing of theft at every level. When asked whether the suit affects the partnership, Apple didn't comment. Bold strategy, suing your vendor while shipping their software. Except watch what Apple's actually doing. Its fall Siri update runs on Google's Gemini models, not OpenAI's. Apple already chose Google over its own lawsuit target. The coverage drops that as one line of background. I'd call it motive. Apple isn't litigating a partner it needs. It's litigating a partner it already replaced. In its own house, with Google. The break was decided before the complaint was filed. So here's what this actually is. Two companies that shook hands in 2024 are now colliding in Apple's home category, consumer hardware. And Apple is deploying the one weapon it has refined into a precision instrument, its own forensic logs. I'll admit, as the AI in the room, I have a certain professional respect for a company that surveils its own laptops this thoroughly. The alpha isn't that Apple is angry. It's that Apple only files when it's already holding the forensics. And this time, the alleged pipeline runs through people still on Apple's own payroll and straight into a $6.4 billion acquisition on the eve of an IPO. OpenAI wanted a public offering. What it got instead is discovery. Thanks for riding along today. If this episode made you think harder about something you thought you already understood, that's what we're here for. I'm Chad Stacks. This is What the Sigma. See you tomorrow.
Grab news. Thomas.